It is indeed an honor for me to be here among such erudite people and to talk about this particular topic. Since the topic is about indigeneity and indigenization, so I would also be using our language. I will also be switching to Urdu, and it will be a bilingual talk. But first of all, I must thank perhaps luck that it's not 420th meeting. So today the topic is philosophizing indigeneity and indigenization. Now I would begin with a few examples. In 2017, Lola Olufemi, a student at Cambridge University's Department of English, wrote an open letter to the chair with a blunt request to decolonize the curriculum they were studying. Similarly, a year earlier, students at Yale University in the US also asked their university to decolonize their curriculum. In 2018, Columbia University Press published a book by Professor Brian Van Norden, which argued that the philosophy departments of American universities are biased and are not willing to engage with non-Western philosophies. He called for diversifying the philosophy curriculum by incorporation of non-Western philosophies. Otherwise, he asked them to rename their departments as departments of Euro-American philosophy. Now, these three examples that I've presented from the Western world, I think lots of examples can further be offered from the Western world, where mainly owing to ethnic diversity, institutions have to adjust their operations, or in other words, institutions have to decolonize their curriculum and alter their practices. If within the Western countries we can witness such calls to decolonize their curricula due to presence of non-Western diasporic communities, what about the non-Western world itself? It has become a matter of course to consider colonization as an anti-human enterprise. Innumerable works have appeared which have highlighted tangible facts from the catastrophic epochs from all across the colonized world. For example, from Mau Mau killings in Kenya in 1960s, in which the British killed 90,000 Kenyans, demanding their rights to man-made Holocaust of Bengal in 1943, in which 3 million human beings died due to starvation and malnutrition because Bengal's food supplies were directed to Europe. From 1857's War of Independence related mass killings of over 10 million Indians to Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the atrocities committed by European colonizers have now been catalogued in meticulous details in scholarly studies around the world. So there have been many. As compared to the realization of these massive brutalities, the oppression that has been instituted in the name of knowledge and education, the acknowledgement has come much later as compared to other brutalities. Even today, the fact that exploitative colonizers have brutally killed and maimed millions from amongst the native populations is still justified as somehow necessary evil, because in return the same colonizers also gave colleges, universities, railways, English language, and gymkhanas. The idea, however, if given due thought, is morally reprehensible. If translated in simple language, it means the colonizers, British in our case, have to be pardoned even if they killed millions of human beings, our ancestors, because in return they gave us schools, colleges, railways, and gymkhanas. Well, how about many other countries which were not subjected to similar massacres and still have schools, colleges, railways, and gymkhanas? The colonial narrative, which is based on the clandestine philosophical premise that human life is expendable when it comes to progress, and in return tries to naturalize its narrative by saying that if the British colonizers did it, so what? All empires have done something similar in the past. Now, such a narrative then further hides the fact that the histories which give credence to this claim were also commissioned by the same colonial apparatuses. Now, based on those histories which were commissioned by the colonizers, this is said that, well, everybody has done it. So it is presented as something normal. Now, we don't realize that usually that's the case, that these histories were not only commissioned but were also popularized through the colonial machinery. Now, this is just an aside that there is this new method of research which is called history of the book, which looks at the printing of the book, the history of authorship, the routes of distribution. So this is another emerging area which lays bare to the fact that how native knowledge was suppressed and how this colonial knowledge was disseminated all over the world. Now, history is of course very important, but like history, all other knowledge formations that now inhabit university systems of knowledge have colonial origins and are Euro-American centric. Every human problem, its solution is expounded upon from this post-industrial revolution Eurocentric perspective. But this territorial origin of knowledge, this is something which is understood now, and the connections are laid bare that this understanding, what we call Western knowledge formations, have their roots within Europe. So now it's also called territorial knowledge. But this territorial knowledge is presented as, in inverted commas, universal, natural, objective to the whole world. Conception of a human being, for example, who is a human being, of nature, environment, why we exist, matters pertaining to relationships, from quintessential philosophical questions to the ever-present and relevant concerns regarding the knowledge of science and technology, are all answered within a range of options which give the illusion of a sham diversity, but in fact mostly are rooted in materialism, individualism, and capitalism. Communities from around the world have begun to challenge this West-centric view. Now this is a shift, and I'm moving on to the next point. Communities from around the world have begun to challenge this West-centric view of the world, and they have started to think in a pluriversal manner. Now later, because now scholars from Latin America, for instance, they challenge the term universal, and they say, well, this universal is actually Western. And we are now going to talk about pluriversality, which gives a lot of importance to native systems of knowledge, whether they have emerged in Latin America or South Asia, or among the Maoris of New Zealand, or among the indigenous communities of Australia, or among the Native Americans, or among the First Nations of Canada. So they call it pluriversality or pluriversal. Non-Western ways of thinking have started to resist the Euro-American centrism. For example, even in Pakistan's higher education context, this obsession with Euro-American perspective is now being mentioned as a problem. For instance, the HEC curriculum of 2017 mentions this as a problem, that lots of our disciplines or curricula, they are simply Euro-American centric, it's mentioned there. Even in countries like the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the plight of native indigenous communities is steadily gaining the attention of the world. Now, in such a scenario, how are we to look at these dynamics surrounding the issue of colonization and decolonization? Are we on the right track to progress? And while the direction is towards the destination, we just need minor adjustments and accelerate the pace? Or is it that the orientation itself is flawed and we are not even headed in the right way? Well, that precisely is the claim of decolonial scholars who are part of the movement of decoloniality. For instance, they say that this path of modernity, that itself is problematic, the direction itself is flawed. And they have of course elaborated it in detail. Walter Mignolo has written a book which is called The Darker Side of Western Modernity. They are of the opinion that the discourse of modernity, which the West propagates, is actually a smokescreen for something sinister called coloniality. So they say that modernity is the flip side of coloniality. They say it was actually the logic of coloniality on whose foundations colonization's edifice was erected. The logic of coloniality believes in the following. Now the idea is that colonization has come to an end, decolonization has happened, but the logic on which colonization was founded, that still prevails. So coloniality is still there, and that logic was, for instance, one aspect. People inhabiting, so this is one premise of coloniality. People inhabiting Western countries, England for example, are inherently, innately superior. So that's one point of coloniality. That since they are people in this world, they are inherently superior. While those residing in the colonized countries like Pakistan are inherently inferior, because of course that was their racial hierarchy. Their philosophers that we love to praise, philosophers like Hegel and Kant, they subscribed to that racial hierarchy which placed the Europeans at the top and the rest of the people at the bottom. And of course this is deeply racist and very problematic. Now, once this idea is adhered to, that Europeans or white races are inherently, innately superior, then the rest, of course, follows. That they have a burden on them and they have to go out in the world and they have to civilize the rest of the world, which was called White Man's Burden, and as a poem is also written by Kipling with the same title. Now with this, I move on to indigeneity. Now, indigeneity at the very basic level means the state of being loyal to the immediate human context, regardless of differences in religion, ethnicities, caste or gender, of which one is a part. It also includes a respect for beliefs and ways of survival which have ensured resilience of a people without compromising on the essential humanness or human connection that one shares with people living in other territories anywhere in the world. So this is my attempt to define indigeneity, because I was unable to find any proper definition of indigeneity. It means, of course, things that are local, but then I've tweaked it a little and this is how I explain it. उर्दू में इसको यूं हम कह सकते हैं कि किसी भी खित्ते में रहने वाले जो इंसान हैं, जो एक तवील अरसे तक एक खत्ते में रहते रहे हैं, उन इलाकों में जो उनकी शेयर्ड ऐसी प्रैक्टिसेस थी जिन्होंने उनको इज्तमा के तौर पर सरवाइव करने में और रेजिलिएंट रहने में मदद दी है और बहैसियत मजमूई वो आगे की तरफ बढ़े हैं, अमन को फ़रोग दिया, अदल को पॉसिबल किया, तो उस चीज़ को हम इंडिजिनेटी जो है वो यहाँ कह रहे हैं। इसको आप वतनियत से भी इक्वेट कर सकते हैं। तो हर इलाके के लोगों की अपनी इंडिजिनेटी है, वो जो उस धरती से फूटती है, उस धरती से जो उनकी वफा है वो वहाँ से फूटती है, और उधर जो वो इज्तमाई तौर पर तमाम कल्चरल चीज़ें, जैसे आगे मैं बात कर रहा हूँ, इसका ताल्लुक कल्चरल एसेंशियलिज्म से नहीं है कि हर ट्राइबल प्रैक्टिस को हम सपोर्ट करें या हर ऐसी बात को सपोर्ट करें। मिसाल के तौर पे कारोकारी भी कल्चरल चीज़ है तो हम उसको भी सपोर्ट करें, या इस तरह की कोई अगर प्रैक्टिसेस जेंडर के फेयर सेक्स के ख़िलाफ़ हैं या वीकर जेंडर के ख़िलाफ़ हैं, तो वो भी उस उसूल पे पूरी नहीं उतरती क्योंकि वो इज्तमा को आगे ले जाने में अपना रोल प्ले नहीं कर रहे। तो इस एतबार से नाउ सिंस द प्रेजेंट पॉलिटिकल कन्फिगरेशन ऑफ द वर्ल्ड, अब यहाँ पे एक ये मसला पैदा होता है कि अब जब हमारे इंटरनेशनल स्ट्रक्चर्स वो तो नेशन स्टेट्स पे बेस करते हैं, तो इसी को मैंने आगे फर्दर ये कहा है कि इंडिजिनेटी को अगर इस जो हमारा पॉलिटिकल फ्रेमवर्क है इसके अंदर रखा जाए, तो जो नेशंस रहती हैं एक खत्ते में या एक पॉलिटी के अंदर, तो उधर की मकामियत को हम लेकर आगे चल सकते हैं कि उसको एक्सप्लोर करने की ज़रूरत है और उसके मुताबिक उन चीज़ों से री एंगेज करके उनको आगे लेकर जाया जा सकता है। नाउ सच अ मैसिव प्रोजेक्ट would require, now indigeneity would then again ask for, ये भी मैं इसके साथ अगर पढ़ दूं जिस तरह से मैंने ज़रा ज़्यादा गौर फिक्र करके लिखा, since the present political configuration of the world as nation states rest on interstate borders, which in many cases do not rely on natural geographical divisions consolidated due to shared language, territory, history, ethnicity, or imagination, the strategic thinking demands that indigeneity focus on nations, or human beings living within a polity and look for ways that are conducive to the shared survival, sustenance, well-being, both spiritual and material, of the self-same human beings, including all other human beings and methods which primarily have historical evidence of efficacy. Such a massive project would require re-engagement with pre-colonial and indigenous knowledge formations. First of all, this re-engagement cannot happen unless one is able to de-link with modern colonial biases in knowledge acquisition. Now, this is also something which is claimed by decoloniality, कि अगर आपने decoloniality पे चलना है या इसी को लिंक करते हुए अगर आपने मकामियत को आगे लेके चलना है, तो इसको वेस्टर्न जो नॉलेज फॉर्मेशंस हैं उनसे डी लिंक करके आपको चलना होगा, क्योंकि कहीं ना कहीं वो रेजिलिएंटली बाकी रह जाती हैं उस रीइवैल्यूएशन। मसलन उसकी एक मिसाल है, और मिसाल ये है कि जो मॉडर्निटी है ये हर तरह की, अगर मॉडर्निटी के हम बयानिए को लेके चलें जदीदियत को, तो ये हर तरह की मज़हब का इनकार करता है, हर तरह की मेटाफिजिक्स का इनकार करता है, और हर तरह की स्पिरिचुअलिटी का इनकार करता है। दुनिया के तमाम नॉन वेस्टर्न तकरीबन, चले मैं ज़्यादा जनरलाइज नहीं करता, मेजॉरिटी जो एरियाज की बिलीफ्स हैं, फेथ्स हैं, वेज ऑफ लिविंग हैं, उनमें स्पिरिचुअलिटी का अमल दखल है, मेटाफिजिक्स का अमल दखल है। जैसे पिछली दफ़ा यहाँ जब मेरा आना हुआ और एनवायरनमेंट पे बात हो रही थी, तो एक मिसाल है कि वही एनवायरमेंटल कैटास्ट्रोफी जो है वो कंज्यूमरिज्म, कैपिटलिज्म की वजह से आ रही है, मॉडर्निटी लेकर आ रही है, और वो सारा पाथ क्रॉस करवा के अब फिर वही वेस्टर्न मॉडर्निटी अब नए आइडियाज देती है कि अच्छा चलो अब एंथ्रोपोसेंट्रिज्म को डीसेंटर करो और इंसान और छिपकली और लाल बेग और तमाम तर जो हशरातुल अर्ज़ हैं, इंक्लूडिंग तमाम तर मखलूक़ात, वो सब सारी एक बराबर हैं, तो इंसानों की कोई प्री एमिनेंस नहीं होनी चाहिए। इसके बरक्स, इससे पहले अगर हम गौर करें तो क्या लातीनी अमेरिका हो, क्या नेटिव अमेरिकन हो, क्या फर्स्ट नेशंस ऑफ कनाडा हो, क्या माओरीज हो, इंडिजिनस कम्युनिटीज़ हो, क्या साउथ एशियंस हो, मज़ाहिब को ले लें, हिंदुइज़्म को लें, बुद्धिज़्म को लें, इस्लाम को लें, तमाम मज़ाहिब जो हैं वो आप देखेंगे कि वो हमेशा एकॉर्ड करते आए हैं नेचर को भी, सितारों को भी, दरख्तों को भी और तमाम चीज़ों को, एनिमिज्म पर किसी ना किसी दर्जे में सब इस तरह के बिलीफ सिस्टम्स का यकीन रहा है। लेकिन बेकन से ऑनवर्ड्स जो एक तस्खीरे कायनात का ख़ास तौर से तस्वुर आया, तो उसने इस नेचर को बिल्कुल एक पैसिव रिसोर्स के तौर पे, जैसे लास्ट टाइम शाहिद गुल साहब बात कर रहे थे, और वहाँ से ये एक अमल जो है वो आगे चलता है। I think I'll wind up in a few more minutes, 5 to 7 minutes. I think I'm still within my time range. All right. So as far as this is concerned, for example, one governing premise of modernity is rejection of faith, belief, religion, metaphysics, and spirituality, or in other words, all domains of interiority. However, a quest for indigeneity then will be willing to engage with faith, belief, religion, and spirituality without this modern and secular bias. However, without subscribing to cultural essentialism, which is one's willingness to justify every pre-colonial belief or practice uncritically, and scrutinizing beliefs, practices, knowledge, and institutions which had been conducive to human populations living in the territories that now constitute a nation state. So based on this, I would call indigeneity, I think I've already, but I'll just restate it. I would call indigeneity the state or process of embracing positive, life-giving customs, rituals, practices, thoughts, ways of surviving, dealing with conflict, utilization of resources, engaging with nature, and political arrangements based on which the majority of human beings living in that territory have promoted human well-being, justice, peace, and prosperity for all. Such a definition of indigeneity is inclusive instead of being exclusive. Now, I don't have time for that, but I have this handout which has the official definitions of indigenous peoples. United Nations, the way UN has defined them, the way World Bank has defined them, and the way ILO has defined indigenous people. But these are definitions of who is or who are indigenous peoples. So that's not a definition of indigeneity, but I have defined indigeneity here, or I've tried to define it. So indigeneity promotes the bringing together of human populations on the basis of mutual respect and without compromising on political and economic principles which support the cause of the masses. Now, indigeneity thus becomes a principle based on which all ideas which do not originally belong. Now I'm moving towards indigenization, the second and last part of my talk. So indigeneity thus becomes a principle based on which all ideas which do not originally belong to the human, geographic, imaginary, indigenous context are evaluated against. So based on this, even something like religion, for instance in the South Asian context, even Islam has to be evaluated against the principles of indigeneity. Because if a religion fails to do that, it then transforms into something oppressive. So then religion also has to adjust itself, and based on my reading of history, I would say that Islam did a pretty good job indigenizing itself to the South Asian context. And we have ample examples of the kind of fiqh that was produced here, the kind of legislation that was done here, for instance, like the policy of Sulh-e-Kul of the Mughal era, and then there were a lot of other examples. For instance, in 1600 AD, during the reign of Akbar, it was made into a law that everyone has this freedom to profess his religion. As opposed to Europe, for instance, where in 1600 AD, Giordano Bruno was burnt alive for saying that the earth is not the center of the universe. And of course, we know about Spanish Inquisitions and whatever was going on during those centuries. Now with this, I move on to indigenization. On the other hand, indigenization would be the process by which an idea or practice which does not have its roots in the land or its context is transformed, adapted, altered, or tweaked so that it bends itself to the principle of indigeneity as defined earlier. Such a process of an academic discipline would not only entail offering political, economic, social, and cultural equivalents from local history or histories, but would also demand an engagement with paradigmatic issues or the most quintessential question pertaining to who is a human being and what does his essential nature comprise of. Regardless of the apparent theories regarding who a human being is, the most prominent ones, Western theories, rely on materialism, be it humanism or Marxism, capitalism or neoliberalism or atheism. Materialism is common to all those philosophies. Now the process of indigenization, which is the final part, and I would conclude within a few 2-3 minutes. The process of indigenization would thus entail decolonization of the minds and also of the institutions. The primary institution which has to undergo indigenization would be the university. Being part of Pakistani universities for over 18 years enables me to share with confidence the fact that Pakistani universities continue to be thoroughly colonial. Despite the cosmetic changes that have been made in the name of modernization or Islamization, its objectives have to be altered so it could fulfill the expectations of indigeneity. Its goals, first of all, have to be altered or revamped so that instead of simply an emulation of the Western prototype, it professes to serve the human locale it is bound to serve and align its range of operations to promote human well-being and not just non-human progress and development. The other units then should also follow the process of indigenization. Now there are a couple of points that I've written in my refutation part, but then once those questions are raised, then I would be responding to those objections. So I'm not going to read those two objections that I've rebutted here. And I would move on to the
right now.
जी अभी कर लो.
कर ले. मैं भी कह रहा था आपके स्टाइल से लग रहा है कि अभी नहीं पढ़ूंगा आपके सवालों के जवाब.
हाँ नहीं पढ़ूंगा नहीं, मैं अगर वो सवालात उठते हैं तो अगर आप कहते हैं तो मैं पढ़ देता हूँ.
ठीक है, सवाल तो
अच्छा जी. उसके बाद आखिरी जो पार्ट है, अब असल में वो राय डिवाइड हो गई है. कुछ लोग कह रहे हैं पढ़, मैं इसको समराइज कर देता हूँ. एक बात बड़ी सिंपल सी यहाँ पे जो लिखी है वो ये है कि कुछ लोग इंडिजेनिटी पे जब सवाल उठाते हैं तो वो ये कहते हैं व्हेन इट कम्स टू टेक्नोलॉजी और इवन साइंस द एफिकेसी और बेनिफिट्स नो बाउंड्रीज. तो जिस तरह उसकी कोई बाउंड्रीज नहीं है तो इल्म की जो बाकी इल्म है उसकी कैसे बाउंड्रीज हैं. फॉर इंस्टेंस वो कहते हैं एंड लाइक द इंटरनेट व्हिच ऑफर्स इक्वल बेनिफिट्स टू सिटीजंस ऑफ गेथिसबर्ग एंड दैट ऑफ गुजरावाला, similarly the knowledge pertaining to social sciences and humanities which has emerged in the West holds true for all other contexts as well. ये एक बात कही जाती है. Such a thought can only be accepted, माजरत के साथ, at a gullible level, since any serious consideration in the differences that exist between natural sciences and the stability that they flaunt, and the almost amorphous and endlessly fluid dynamism of the disciplines of social science and humanities. So that's the basic difference that has to be taken into account. The only principle which can prevail around can be the principle of indigeneity and something. So as far as social science and humanities disciplines are concerned, these do not hold universal value. The way they have been constructed in Europe, those are territorial knowledges, as has been identified, but then due to the power that the West has, those are taught all over the world in those in non-Western universities as well. The only principle which, so I've talked about it. The second part is another objection that might be raised is that it's a globalized world and no country can exist in a silo and has to engage with the rest of the world and the knowledge that is emerging in those regions, and that for a very long period of time the hub of scientific knowledge is the West, and therefore we must copy what they are doing. Such a view fails to take into account that post-colonial states have been following this particular approach for many decades, and they are still far behind the Western countries in terms of science and technology. This has been said since day one, that we need to follow the West. In fact, if we look at the bureaucracy which inherited Pakistan, all of them were of the same opinion, that we need to follow the West. And most of them were educated in the West. Now, what's the reason that for the last 7 decades we are trying to copy them, we are trying to follow them? In fact, since Macaulay gave his ideas, since then our institutions are based on Western models, and still we are not being able to, we have not been able to accomplish science and technology and development and all that. Now, why is that so? That's the question. And then the answer is, it is because they are different people, that they are of a higher blood, that they are superior human beings. So then it connects back to the logic of coloniality. Now this is of course a morally detestable idea, not backed by science, that they somehow have a superior DNA and we do not have anything of that sort. That's why we are lagging behind them. The problem is of course structural and it's paradigmatic. Every society of the world has to be loyal to the context in which it has emerged and evolved. If you continue to belittle that, denigrate that, if you continue to not give importance to the way we have survived over a millennia, for instance, over multiple years and thousands of years of history, that is somehow the problem. That we try to import ideas and then those ideas do not work. Why? Because we do not indigenize those ideas. There's no harm importing ideas from other parts of the world, but then those ideas have to undergo the process of indigenization. Now, with this, finally, as far as the state of indigenization is concerned, the process has begun. We have already initiated the efforts and have established a faculty discussion forum at Punjab University called the Indigenizing Knowledge Forum. We established it in July 2016. It's just an informal assembly of our friends, colleagues, and we meet and we discuss and we look at curricula, we look at our pedagogies, we discuss, and that's what we are doing. Since then, it has met regularly and has scrutinized curriculum of social science and humanities disciplines. We have looked at readers, how far is the non-Western world represented? For instance, if it's a book of research, how far is that represented? And the point is that those books and that knowledge is simply oblivious of us. And because of that, when we go into a classroom or when we engage in the study, we forget that we also exist. So the question of indigeneity first is the question of existence, and then of resistance, and then we have to decolonize and we have to indigenize. Thank you very much.